cover a lot of ground tonight, so let's start here. Let's start with the feeding of the 4,000. Look at Matthew 15 and start in verse 29. Matthew 15, start in verse 29. Here we go. Jesus went out from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee. And he went up on the mountain and he sat down there, and there great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame and the blind and the crippled and the mute, and that's not all, just many others. And they put at his feet, and he healed them. So these were a lot of the maladies of the day: blindness, lameness, crippled, mute, and a variety of other things. It's not an exhaustive list. And they bring them to Jesus, and he healed them. Verse 31. So the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, and the crippled healthy, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd. Sound familiar? We've heard this before. I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7, and a few small fish. And directing the crowds to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up the 7 baskets full of broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan, or Magdala, some people will say. So let's stop right there. It's a very similar account to the feeding of the 5,000. We've already studied that account. This account is mentioned only in Mark and Matthew. Now, the feeding of the 5,000 is mentioned in all 4 Gospels. This is only mentioned in Matthew and Mark. And once again, there's all these variety of ailments that are bringing to Jesus. He's feeding them. The similarity, one of the biggest similarities between the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000 is it says very plainly that Jesus had compassion on them. You get the sense that that's really important for us to get, that Jesus had compassion on them. And he didn't want to send them away. They'd been with him 3 days. He didn't want them fading along the way, so he multiplies loaves and fishes. That's all we're going to do on that. We covered the feeding of the 5,000 in great detail. We're going to kind of move on from there. Let's look at this. The Pharisees and the Sadducees ask for a sign. They ask for a sign. Go to Matthew. We're going to stay in Matthew, chapter 16, start in verse 1. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to test him. And they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. And he answered, when it's evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be stormy today, because the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. So he left them and departed. It's kind of like, so there, and he's gone. This is kind of an interesting passage. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this passage. But once again, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are testing Jesus. And basically, they're trying to trip him up, and they're asking him for a sign. Now, interesting thing is, Pharisees and the Sadducees were rarely on the same team. They didn't get along. They had a lot of differences. And they butted heads more often than not. But in Jesus, they had this common irritation. They both were interested in getting rid of Jesus, basically. So this is the one thing they could find to agree on. So here they come together, and they're trying to deal with him. But they didn't accept the signs. They had seen signs. They had seen him do miracles. They had seen him do healings. Some of them probably saw him feed these multitudes. They had seen the signs, but they weren't accepting those as valid proof that he was the Messiah. So, interesting enough, they don't just ask for a sign, they say, show them a sign from heaven. In other words, what they were saying is, show us something from God that only God would do that would confirm that you're the Messiah. So Jesus chides them, and he says, basically, you can tell me the weather, what the weather's going to be. You can read the signs of the weather, but you cannot read the signs of the time. Now, this was insulting to them. It just really was. Why would that phrase, you can read the signs of the weather, but you can't read the signs of the time, why would that be so insulting? I always, when I wait for you to answer, I always want to hear that like Jeopardy clock. Doo, 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 doo. Yes, I saw a hand, I thought. Nope, just me. Why would this be so insulting?
Could it be because they knew the Messiah was coming, and he was the Messiah who was right in front of them?
Could it be that they knew the Messiah was coming and he was right in front of them? Yeah, I think so. Well, remember, the scribes and the Pharisees were experts in the prophets and the law and the prophets. They were expert. They knew the prophecies about the Messiah better than anybody. They knew all the promises. They knew what had to be fulfilled for somebody to be the Messiah. They knew this backwards and forwards. And Jesus is basically looking, it'd be like going to your local attorney and saying, you don't know anything about the law, do you? I mean, that's kind of the interaction that Jesus is having with them. They're experts in the prophets and in the law, and he says, you can't even read the signs of the time. Very insulting to them. And they, more than anyone, should have been able to spot the Messiah. And they just couldn't. And then he says, if it's an evil and adulterous nation that demands a sign. So here's my question to you. If an evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign, why did Jesus keep giving them so many signs? The questions get harder as we go along. If it's an evil and adulterous generation that demands a sign, then why did Jesus keep giving them signs? For prophecy's sake? You're asking.
Was it, yeah, because I'm not sure. Was it prophesied, these things?
Was it prophesied? Well, a lot of things that he had done were prophesied, especially when you read through Matthew. Matthew is writing to a Jewish population, so Matthew is constantly saying, this happened because it was prophesied, this happened because it was prophesied. He doesn't do that here, though. I mean, it seems to me if Jesus is going to say, only an evil and adulterous generation demands a sign, it seems to me like he'd quit giving them, but he just keeps giving them signs. Why?
Turn them from their evil ways to look back to him.
To try to get them to turn? Yeah, maybe. I think we're going to see that later, though that's probably not the case here. First of all, if an evil and adulterous generation needs a sign, and Jesus keeps giving signs, it's probably because we're the evil and adulterous generation. Right? I mean, that's why he keeps giving us signs, because that's what an evil and adulterous generation needs, is signs. So that could be one reason why. But I think the real reason is when Jesus did these signs and miracles, if you look through the Gospels and he's doing these signs and miracles, he's doing them out of a heart of compassion. He's not doing it for recognition. He's doing it because of compassion. The Pharisees are saying, hey, do this so we can recognize who you are. And Jesus is having compassion and ministering to the people, which should have given them the recognition of who he was. So they were on completely different wavelengths. Yes, he was showing them love. It's like the old thing about humility. If you chase humility, you'll never find it. But humility comes to you. The minute you think you're a humble person, you've just lost it. Jesus is not doing these signs for the recognition to show that he's Messiah. He's doing it because the Messiah has compassion on people, which is really important for us to register and to realize. Now here's the interesting thing. Go back to the text. It says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. But then he said, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah. What's the sign of Jonah? Pardon?
3 days in the belly of the fish.
Yes, the sign of Jonah. Jonah was 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of a fish. So what's Jesus referring to? He's referring to being in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. Now, they would have not gotten this. His own disciples would not have gotten this. They could not. We're going to see later Jesus is going to start being more and more blunt with them about his upcoming death and his resurrection. And they still didn't get it. But Jesus is telling them, this is the only sign you're getting. Yes, Willie?
Jesus also, with that sign, he took all of our iniquities with him.
Yes, it says that with his death, he paid for all of our iniquities. Exactly. But here's the interesting thing about this. If that's the sign, the 3 days and 3 nights in the earth, basically, that's the only sign they're getting. If Jesus was going to do more miracles, and he was, the raising of Lazarus, for instance, he was going to do these, why would he tell the scribes and the Pharisees that the only sign they're getting is the sign of Jonah? Because he's going to be doing more signs, so why tell them this is all you're getting? Yeah, they're hard questions this evening. Yes? Right. If they recognize it, that death and resurrection is kind of like the trump of all signs, you know. Excuse me if you're on the other side of the political aisle, but it's like the trumping of all the signs. It doesn't get any bigger than that, you know. So it's like Jesus is saying, look, if you don't get this one, you're not going to get any of them, you know. The only sign you're getting, the only one you might listen to is the sign of Jonah. But we know that even when Jesus was resurrected 3 days and 3 nights later, we know they still ignored it. So it's not like he was saying, I'm not doing any signs anymore. He was basically saying, there is one big monumental sign coming, and if you don't get that, nothing else matters. And so here's kind of like this first hint Jesus gives that this is what's going to happen. Like I said, none of them really got it. Okay, let's move on to this one. Jesus warns about the influence of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Look at Matthew 16, look at verse 5. When the disciples reached out the other side of the Sea of Galilee, they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. It's very interesting. They probably coming from Magdala, so which means they're probably coming to the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And when they arrive, Jesus makes this kind of random statement about, hey, watch out about the leaven of the Pharisees. You know, and he hasn't prefaced it with anything. It's just like this kind of random, out of context statement. And so the disciples are trying to figure out, what is he talking about? And finally, they realize that no one's really brought any bread, which is kind of bad because they just collected 7 baskets full of the stuff not too long ago, but no one brought any bread. And I can almost hear them. Oh, I thought you were bringing the bread. No, you were supposed to. It was your turn to bring the bread. Well, I didn't know where it was at. You can hear this kind of conversation going on with them. It's just interesting to see them try to figure out. They assume that that's what Jesus is talking about. Now, look at verse 8. But Jesus, aware of this discussion that they're having, said, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive?" It's like, you still don't get it? That's what he's saying. Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Not how many baskets that were gathered, but how many you gathered. You know, you were there. You saw this. Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered. How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay, let's stop right there for just a second. What do you think Jesus is saying here? No right or wrong answer. What do you think he's saying? The Pharisees are evil. Maybe. I think that's a little out of context because he's talking to beware the leaven of the Pharisees, and we'll talk about that. But in this conversation he's having with his disciples, what is he telling them? What's he trying to say? They don't have no faith. Well, he does say that. He does say, oh, you of little faith. But why is their faith? Why don't they have faith? Why would he call them out like that?
Well, the prophet, when they said something, it had to happen. If not, they would be stoned to death.
Right.
A lot of what the Pharisees were saying was not true. I mean, they weren't even recognizing Christ.
Right, right.
Therefore, their religion or their faith was not a saving faith.
Right, right.
They're going to be aware of this faith they have because it's not going to bring you to salvation.
Yeah, so you have the Pharisees with their teaching of their traditions, which is tedious and trying and doesn't seem to be producing a whole lot. And then you have this prophet over here, and as you said, a false prophet would be stoned. You could tell a prophet was a real prophet if his prophecies came true. And here he is overdoing these miracles and everything's happening. And so you kind of have these two contexts. But remember, go back. He's basically, he says it in the text here. He says, do you not yet perceive? Do you not yet remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered up? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many? You were there, guys. You saw me pick up, you saw me take just a handful of stuff and feed 5,000 or 4,000 people. You saw that. You know I can produce bread, Now, in Mark's, I believe it's in Mark's account of this, Mark says they had 1 loaf. Mark says they took inventory and all they had was 1 loaf. So it's like Jesus is saying, okay, I fed 5,000 with 5 loaves. I fed 4,000 with 4 loaves. You should know that 1 loaf is probably enough for us. And he's basically saying, you still have such little faith. And isn't it like us? We've seen God do things for us. We can go back and see blessings and times he's pulled us out of a jam and something like that. We can see that in our history. But then the next one we get in, we're wringing our hands because we're afraid he's not going to come through with it for us. I mean, it's just human nature. And that's why sometimes a good look back is a good way to remember forward, because God has blessed us, and if you go back and look, it should make us prone to say, you know what, he handled that, I bet he can handle this. And so this is kind of what Jesus is getting at. Really, guys, you're worried about bread? Really? So then they get it. Look at verse 12. Then they understood that he did not tell them beware of the leaven of the bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's using leaven to refer to the Pharisees and the Sadducees' teaching. Now, leaven is something that when it gets into the dough, it expands, it grows. And teaching does that. Good teaching and bad teaching does that. It gets into you, and it affects you, and it grows you in one way or the other. And so Jesus is saying, beware about the Pharisees' teaching, because when it gets into you, it's going to have an effect on you. And I don't think the Pharisees were around at this time, because they would have had a fit if they'd heard this. Jesus would have sounded treasonous, because he'd have basically sounded like he was saying, don't pay attention to them. And he's not saying that, but he's saying, beware about their teaching. All right, let's do this one. Jesus heals a blind man in Bethsaida. Look at, for this we got to go to Mark. We'll come back to Matthew, but for this we got to go to Mark. So go to Mark chapter 8. You only find this account in Mark. Mark chapter 8. We'll start in verse 22. We're going to breeze through this kind of quickly because we really need to get to the next piece before we quit. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand. Now, this is interesting. He takes the blind man by the hand and led him not just away from the people that brought him, but led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes, and laid his hands on. How would you like that? You go to your optometrist and says, well, let me see. You know? What are you doing? Oh, this is how I heal these eyes. You know, Jesus takes him out of the village and spits in his eye, in both of them. And then he lays his hands on them. And very, very interesting. He lays his hand on him and says this. He asked him, do you see anything? Verse 24, and he looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. He wasn't seeing clearly yet. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home, saying, do not even enter the village. This is really unorthodox to start with. And I mean just the way in which Jesus chooses to heal him by spitting in his eyes. It's also a little unorthodox because this is the only act of healing in the Gospels in which Jesus seems like he has to do it twice. It's like a two-stage healing. When I read it, I want to say, he missed it the first time. And I don't think that's it. I mean, if he can tell Lazarus, get up and walk out, then he can probably do this. So there's something else going on here that I don't even understand. But this was kind of a two-stage healing. It's the only one you'll see in Scripture. And he was blind at first, so even being able to see fuzzy images that look like trees in front of you was a plus, but it wasn't good enough. Because when Jesus heals, he doesn't heal just a little bit. He heals all the way. So he lays his hands back on him again, and he sees. And then not only that, I find it interesting that he tells him, don't even go back to the village. Okay, these guys brought them. They're waiting on him to see what happens. And Jesus says, don't even go back there. Now, I don't know what that's about, and we're not told what that's about. But to me, it's almost like Jesus is saying, hey, you're not blind anymore. Don't go back to people that are blind. Because remember, they don't ask him to just heal him. They say, by laying your hands on him. Again, they're mandating how Jesus is going to do this. And we've talked about that in another passage, in another healing in Scripture. So we don't know why, but there was something up with these guys that brought him, that Jesus said, hey, don't even go back there, go around. Go a different way. Don't even go back to the village. All right, here's what we need to get to tonight, and I've got to cover this before we close, so listen fast. Peter's great confession about Jesus. Peter's great confession about Jesus. We have come to one of the most well-known events in the gospel. One of the most well-known. It's mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, Mark and Luke have shorter accounts. Their accounts are a little more edited. Matthew adds some more things. He's a little more complete in his account. And he adds this dialogue with Peter about the revelation he's had and about what he's supposed to do with that. So we're going to be looking at Matthew. So go back to Matthew, and we're going to be looking at Matthew 16. Get back there with you. Matthew chapter 16, because his account is a little more detailed. Look at verses 13 through 15. Now, when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? In other words, who are people saying that I am? What are they saying about me? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Okay, let's stop right there. Who do you say that I am? Jesus asked his disciples, what's the word on the street? What's the hubbub out there? What are people saying about me? Who are they saying that I am? And they said, well, here's what we're hearing. Some of the people believe you're John the Baptist. You know, some of the people believe that you're Elijah. Some of the people believe that you're Jeremiah or maybe one of the other prophets. Why would they believe that? Why would they be thinking that? Because he was a prophet. But I think primarily the prophets mentioned here were big guys. I mean, they were forceful. They were powerful. They did miracles. They stood up against authority. These were the bigwigs of prophets. And that's what Jesus was doing. He was standing up against authority. He was doing these miracles. He was speaking out forcefully. And so they just assumed, we've read all these stories about these prophets. They've come back. And remember, one of the messianic prophecies was that he was going to send an Elijah or even Elijah himself, was going to send an Elijah ahead of him. Now, we know from our earlier studies that that was a reference to John the Baptist, but they're beginning to wonder if maybe Jesus is the Elijah, the forerunner to the Messiah that's coming. And so they say, well, this is who they're saying you are. But then Jesus changes the question, and he asks his disciples, who do you think I am? Why is that such an important question?
Previous answer told him what Peter was saying.
Right.
He got personal with his disciples and wanted to know exactly do you know who I am?
Right. So it's like a funnel. Who is everybody saying I am? Okay, but now I want to know, who do you personally think I am? And the reason that question is so important is it doesn't make any difference what everybody else thinks. It makes a difference what you think about Jesus and who you think he is. It's not about everybody else. You heard this before growing up. Well, if such and such jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge too? I mean, it's kind of the same deal. It doesn't make any difference what they think. We even see that at the end of the book of John, where Jesus is resurrected. He's walking by the seaside. Peter's walking with him. John's a little bit behind him, and Jesus is telling Peter what kind of things he's going to suffer in the future. And Peter says, well, what about John? And Jesus says, you worry about you, okay? We're talking about you right now. And I just had to do that with a granddaughter the other day. Well, my parents do it. We're not talking about your parents. We're talking about you. No one likes that. But this is what Jesus is doing because it doesn't make any difference what everybody else thinks. It makes a difference what you believe. So look what happens. Look at verse 16. Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter does what he always does. He's impulsive. He has no kind of impulse control. He just jumps out and he speaks. And he gets it right. He says, you're the Christ. The word means the anointed one or the Messiah. He also calls him the Son of the living God. They were in Caesarea Philippi. It was a great place with lots of idols, lots of big statues and idols. And so he doesn't just say you're the Son of God. He said you're the Son of the living God. So look at Jesus' response in verse 17. And Jesus answered, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So first, Jesus calls him by his full and proper name. He calls him Simon, son of Jonah. It's kind of like when your parents use your full name to get your attention. You know, anytime they throw the middle name in, you need to pay attention, right? And so Jesus kind of uses his full and proper name, Simon, son of Jonah. And next he tells him that he didn't come to this conclusion on his own. This information was not conjured up by him. This information was given to him. I don't know if he was trying to keep Peter from getting a big head or if he was trying to teach him some theology, but he's basically saying this level of information you didn't just concoct on your own. This was handed to you. So look at verse 18. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Okay, so he officially changes his name from Simon, son of Jonah, to Peter. And then it seems like he's giving Peter a very special place in the church and in the authority of the church. Now, our Catholic brothers and sisters see this passage one way, okay? They believe that this passage points directly to the fact that Peter was the first pope. And you, to be honest with you, if you study this really carefully and you get into all the language, you can see how they can come to that. They believe that Peter is the first pope. Now, as you would expect, I'm taking a different track on this, okay? And I'll just tell you why I'm taking a different track, okay? You might expect that. I have a different view. The passage is built off of a word play. Okay, the passage is built off of wordplay Jesus is using. When he says, you are Peter, that is the word Petros. When he says, upon this rock I will build my church, the word rock is the word Petra. So he's using a wordplay between Petros for Peter and Petra for rock. Now, I've heard it said before, some people will say, well, Petros, Peter, means a little bitty pebble, and Petra means this great kind of monolith. But I'll be really honest with you, when I dig into the languages and into the study, it's not quite that clear and definitive. On top of that, but what we do know is we know they're two different words. They're two different words. And that leads me to believe that when Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church, since he's using a different word, he's not talking about Peter. That's my first clue. If he was talking about Peter, he would have said, upon this Petros. But he doesn't. He says, upon this Petra. So he chooses a different word. That's my first clue. Not only that, but on top of that, in Ephesians 2, and we're not going here, you might want to write the reference down, but on Ephesians 2, 19 through 20, we're told that the household of God is built upon the apostles and prophets, plural. And then we're told that Jesus is the cornerstone, what it really gets lined up and formed on. So that would lead me to believe that we're not talking about Peter. Another thing that would lead me to believe that, we're told, we know that Peter was not infallible. The Pope is believed, especially when he sits in the chair, to be infallible. We know Peter is not infallible because Jesus called him down. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." So Jesus called him out, and Paul called him out. So we know he's not infallible. And finally, the word church here doesn't refer to an organization, a religious organization. It refers to the followers of Jesus that are called out of the normal, everyday world. As a matter of fact, that's what the word church is. The word church is ekklesia, and it means the called out ones. So we know we're not talking about that. So with all of that in mind, my view is that when Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church, he's referring to the truth that God revealed to Peter about who Jesus is. You know, because he says before that, remember, keep everything in context, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. And then this becomes, this is what I'm going to build my church on. That truth that God gave you, that's what I'm going to build my church on. Does that make sense?
Are you talking about faith?
No, I'm talking about the gospel. The gospel is, who is Jesus?
No, Peter's faith.
Peter's faith. It could be. Some commentators will say it's talking about Peter's faith. But I don't come to Christ. I don't come to heaven. I don't come to those things by his faith. I have to by mine. And my faith in what he said and what was later passed down. Okay? Anyone else?
Brad, didn't they have to get to this point? Each one of the apostles have to get to this point. What Peter just recognized before they could continue and start the church, and we have records of that.
Yes.
I mean, they all had to get to that point for what Peter did.
Yeah, they all had to come to that individually. And we know that even Peter, with this great declaration, later denies Jesus 3 times. Okay? And so, which brings us to the next portion of this passage. With regards to the church, Jesus says the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, you need to know the following about this. In the ancient Near East literature, Caesarea Philippi was known as kind of like the gates of the underworld. And I don't know why I didn't get into that deep of a study, but it's known as the gates of the underworld. So it makes sense that Jesus would use that phrase when he says the gates of hell will not prevail against it. You also need to know this. In the original Greek text, the word against is not there. In the original Greek text, what it literally says is the gates of hell shall not withstand it. So that, to say that the gates of hell will not withstand it, that the realm of the dead, if you will, that evil will not withstand it, basically says it will not withstand the advance of the called out ones of the church. The gates of hell will not stand against the called out ones. It will not prevail. May not fall as quickly as we want, get pushed back as far as we want, but this is what it's saying. Now look at what else Jesus tells Peter. Look at verse 19. I will give you, he's talking to Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, again, this sounds like he's given Peter a really special place here, and we're going to talk about what that is. But what this is doing is setting up a contrast. Gates of hell, keys to the kingdom. So he's setting up this kind of word picture between the two. And again, this is another controversial passage, depending upon how you interpret it. Some would say that this refers to Peter's authority. Peter has authority over the church to permit and to prohibit. So he's the final authority of the church. Others would say, no, this gives that authority to the disciples. And we do know that in Acts, the disciples did have some authority in calling councils about what the church should be about and what it shouldn't be about. But again, here's how I look at this verse. What are keys for? Keys let you in, keys keep you out. All right? Basically, they let you have entry or they deny entry. Now, entry into the kingdom of heaven requires that you know Christ and not only know him, you accept the truth about him. That's entry into the kingdom of heaven. To not know Jesus and to not know the truth about him restricts you from access to the kingdom of heaven. So, because the disciples have been given this knowledge and this truth, and they will understand it even better after the resurrection, they now have the keys to spreading the good news, increasing entry, or restricting the good news, keeping the good news to themselves, restricting entry. The same is true for us. You and I have keys to the kingdom because we know who Christ is. And we believe the truth about him. What we do with that will either be keys that let people in or keys that keep people out. Make sense? Questions? Man, the room got quiet all of a sudden. All right, last verse. He sums this all up finally with something that sounds counterintuitive. Verse 20. Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. That just seems wrong to me. Why would you Peter has said, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God. Jesus says, man, God has shown this to you. And this is the truth I'm going to build my kingdom on. And he's building it all up. And then he says, now don't tell anybody. Really? I think it's because of this. Because they weren't ready to use these keys until the day of Pentecost, when they received the Holy Spirit. Jesus said, stay, remember, right before he ascended into heaven, stay in Jerusalem and wait for the promise of the Father. They could not have done anything with this until the whole day of Pentecost and the Holy Spirit comes. So, I don't think he was saying, never tell this to anybody ever. He was just saying, now's not the time. Your time's coming. All right? Okay, we're running out of time. So let me give you some takeaways, and then we'll go. I hope I haven't confused you. It's a very controversial passage, and depending upon how you were raised and how you're brought up and your theology and everything, I'm just giving you what I've got and what I think. You can think something different. Let me give you a takeaway. The thing that determines whether people are your bother or your business is compassion. People will either be your bother or they'll be your business. And what makes that call is your compassion. That's why Jesus, he has all these people come to him. They've been with him for 3 days. You would think he wants a break. He's fed them, or he's getting ready to feed them, but he still sticks with them. After 3 days, he would think, okay, I've had enough. I need a break. I'm going away. He says, no, I don't want to send them away. I have compassion on them. I want to feed them before they go. People will either be a bother or they'll be your business, and compassion determines which that will be. Jesus has risen from the dead. We do not need any other signs. It's the only sign you need. You know, it may not feel like enough in the moment, in your circumstance, in your crisis, but Jesus told the scribes and the Pharisees, hey, the only sign you're really getting here is the sign of Jonah. So if Jesus is in the grave 3 days and 3 nights, and then he comes out, that sign trumps everything. It's the only sign we need. Another takeaway. In the end, it doesn't matter what others believe about Jesus. What matters is what you believe about Jesus. That's what matters. Because our faith is personal. It's a one-on-one relationship. It doesn't matter what other people believe about me as a spouse. What matters is what my wife believes about me as a spouse. You know? And I have people in marriage counseling all the time saying, how's come I can get along with all these people I work with, but I can't get along with my spouse? Because you don't have to live with them. You don't have to pay bills with them. You don't have to sleep with them. You don't have to see them in the morning. So what matters is you two, not everybody else. And so what matters when it comes to Christ in the very end is what you believe about him. Another takeaway, our knowledge of Christ is only given by God. It is not gained by our intelligence and our effort. Now, you may say, well, but I should be reading the Bible and maybe going to Bible studies. Yeah, absolutely. But it's still given to you by God. First of all, who gave you this? God gives us the Scripture. And you've been here before. I mean, I've been to seminary. And sometimes I read this and go, what? I don't get it. What is this supposed to mean? And it may be a month later till something happens and God goes, that's what this means right here. Our knowledge of who he is comes from him. It's a gracious gift. It's not our intelligence or our effort. All right. Last one. Personal knowledge of Jesus leaves you personally responsible. It does. It leaves you personally responsible. When you know who he is, now you're responsible for what you're going to do with this and whether or not you're going to share it. And I've told you this before. That's what made me so mad when I was 22 years old and thought I had my life all together, and some guy knocked on my door and shared Jesus with me. He just made me mad because my life was good without that information. And then he gives me this information, and now I'm responsible to do something with it. And that's just the way it works. You're responsible. You're responsible for how you respond personally, but you're responsible for what you do with that in the lives of other people. And that's what Jesus was telling Peter. You now are going to have the keys to the kingdom. What are you going to do with it? You're going to open up the gates for more and more people, or are you going to just keep it to yourself and keep more and more people out? This is our responsibility. All right, we need to close. Questions? Comments? Arguments? Yes, Willie.
Well, when I become a Christian, I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and I was changed overnight.
Yes, that's what happens. When we receive Christ, when we become a Christian, we're changed.
Right, and people looked at me different.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, they do look at you different, some of them. My old buddies wanted me to come back to the bar and play music, and when I didn't do it, they could not figure out what that was all about. And to be honest with you, I couldn't figure it out either. I wasn't really sure either. But it does. It changes you. Someone else.
All I know is my grandfather was a mean man. He got saved, and overnight, he became a different man. I'm talking about mean.
I'm grateful that you finished that out because I thought you were going to stop with my grandfather was a mean man, and I'm going, I don't know what to do with that. But absolutely. Now, that doesn't mean we become Mary Poppins the minute Jesus comes into our lives, but it does mean it changes our wiring some, and it gives us some different directions to point in. But the problem is a lot of us kind of camp out on what Jesus is going to do for me. And that's just a stepping stone to the next. How is he going to use me in the life of others? That's where this thing gets perpetuated. And so eventually, on the day of Pentecost, these disciples who now have the keys suddenly are going to know what to do with those keys. Because the Holy Spirit's going to teach them, empower them, push them, send them out. And we just don't have to wait on that. We already have that. We just have to move, you know?
Glory in your life is unbelievable when you have it.
It is unbelievable, and you know, we focus so much on having, what's the word I'm looking for? We focus so much on wanting things to be good now, to be pleasant now, to be, and you know, really, if you're a believer, you have an eternity upon eternity upon eternity of good and pleasant and wonderful. That's not why we're here. God can make everything right and will for eternity upon eternity. He's not interested in making everything right in our lives right now. He's as interested in growing us and growing our character. He can give us comfort for eternity upon eternity when we're in heaven. It's not comfort he's after while we're here. He's after character and connection. And that is much harder. Any God can snap his fingers and give me anything I want, but a God that has to walk with me through my muck so that he can grow my character, it's a much bigger God. And that's the one we have. Yes?
I think that is why Corrie ten Boom is so inspirational, because she is somebody who has had so much hardship throughout her life, but she has always turned away from it, as in she has been selfless.
Yes.
Continues to be that way no matter what. And she talks about not feeling sorry for yourself.
Yeah, she's talking about Corrie ten Boom. My fear is that there's a whole generation that doesn't even know her, two, not familiar with the things she's written, which is really, really powerful. And I used one of her quotes at Grovetown Sunday, and I think I've used it in here, where she said, hold things lightly in your hand because it hurts when God has to pry your fingers off of them. Very, very good quote. All right, we need to go, so let me pray. Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for your word. Thank you for how it challenges us even today. I'm always amazed that an ancient manuscript written to an ancient people is still just as pertinent today as anything. And so, Father, help us to walk out different. Help us to walk out thinking different, acting different, believing different. Somehow, some way, just make a change in us from your word so that we won't be the same. And we ask for that in Jesus' name. Amen.